Shalom, it is me once again, but for the last time. The president asked, when we agreed that he would come, he asked to speak for 40 minutes, but after the medical procedure, his doctors recommended that he shouldn't come at all. But the president took a leadership decision, and he said, I will come, but only for 10 minutes in order not to fall out with my doctors. So what I'm going to do in these last 30 minutes left by the president, then I'm going to tell you what's written in this book, because people don't read books nowadays. This is what we gave and submitted to the president. It's the summary of the strategic assessment of the state of Israel, written by the INSS, a kind of balance of our condition at the dawn of 2017. And just like in any balance, it's a snapshot that actually takes a snapshot of a situation. And it's not too bad. It's not bad at all. And I will overview the reasons why this balance now in the state of Israel, in the various national security aspects, is the best ever in its last 69 years since its inception. I will explain as well why the balance is not enough. You need to look ahead, and you need to look at least at 7 and 10 years ahead, and only then can we see the plethora of challenges. So I will very swiftly overview the reasons why I think that our situation is good. First of all, there isn't an existential threat on the state of Israel. We are surrounded by hundreds of millions of Arabs who would love us not to exist at all, 1 billion Muslims who don't want us to exist, but none of them can actually instruct their armed forces to eradicate us. We were, in 1948, in an existential threat in 67, 73. Nowadays, and that's the second point, it has the strongest army, strongest military from a significant point of view in the region. Our intelligence is excellent. Based on its information, the Israeli Air Force can bomb with a ton weight, exactly precise precision to 2 meters at any point between the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. And its ground forces, its navy, they are of the cutting edge levels with excellent arms, equipment, commanders. And that is the third point that I want to talk about. The state of Israel enjoys deterrence capability of very strong quality. And this Israeli deterrence is constructed on the power of the IDF, on the image that has been created for the state of Israel because of what exists in Dimona and because of its strong alliance with the United States. And each one of these rings or links in that chain of deterrence is of ultimate importance. Just a word of warning about deterrence. Deterrence is a kind of account, an account that your enemy does with you when it can pull the trigger. And when we are sitting here in this beautiful auditorium of the Eretz Israel Museum, this museum, there are hundreds of missiles aimed at it from Iran, thousands of rockets and missiles from Lebanon, some that are left in Syria, and maybe even a few left in the Gaza Strip. But no one pulls that trigger because everyone accounts and does that accounting, because they know that the results of pulling that trigger are not something that they wish to bear. But everyone knows from when they studied arithmetic and accounts and mathematics, sometimes people make mistakes in that arithmetic. So therefore, the deterrence is weighted historically and assessed historically. For example, if we're talking about the Lebanese border, although we did actually hit out at the head of the Hezbollah movement, and of course we are blamed for that. And we'll talk about the convoys of arms that are being taken to Hezbollah. No one takes responsibility. Immediately Israel is blamed, but still does nothing. Israel has succeeded in stabilizing deterrence even against terror organizations, a topic that professors of political science would say is impossible. How can you deter a guerrilla or a terrorist organization? ISIS cannot be deterred, but Israel actually deters Hezbollah, Hamas, and deters even the IS. Sort of a couple of hundred of their people are on the Golan Heights border and in the Sinai Peninsula. The other most important point is not connected to war, but rather to peace. The peace agreements that Israel has with its two most important neighbors, Egypt, who is the leader of the Arab world, and Jordan, that has the longest border. Both of these peace agreements have lasted despite all the upheavals, the tectonic ones, the really harsh ones, and the various sort of people who have taken power, and the people have went to the streets, and yet somehow they did not collapse. They didn't topple or dismantle these agreements, because these peace agreements are not only in Israel's interest, they are of no less interests also of Egypt and Jordan, not only of the regimes but of the people themselves. We had the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and even they did not touch it. They didn't detrimentally affect it. Not even the military appendix to it. But for many years, we have had overlapping interests with the Sunni pragmatic Arab world. Many countries that don't have diplomatic ties with us, not like Jordan and Egypt that does, if it's talk about Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and additional states. They envision Iran as their main threat, or the ISIS. They don't see Israel as a threat, but rather an ally that can fight against that threat. Syria. Syria was a military threat, a main one, since our achievement of peace with Egypt. It started off in Iraq. That actually, if we're talking about the disappearance of that eastern front, but the Hezbollah and Syria, with the help of the Hezbollah, was our main threat on the IDF. If you ask me, as the commander of the Intelligence Directorate in 2007, 2008, if I actually had to rank it, I would say that the threat then was about 8.5 to 10. It was that, talking about Russian and Scud missiles with chemical warheads, long-range missiles, first-class guerrilla fighters. Yes, a commander that for any Israeli division to get to Damascus, for any Israeli commander, would have been a real tough task. But nowadays, this army has disappeared for any practical needs. It is too busy in a civil strife. It has really basically disappeared because of the Sunnis that are 60% of the Syrian population are not drafted. Basically, they no longer have any of their warheads, their warfare, any of their actual weapons. So now the threat is a more 2.3, I would say, 2 to 3. But there is a change in the United States, and that change is very problematic for the world. There is so much uncertainty, so many issues that the American people will have to grapple with. But in the sort of narrow prism of view of the state of Israel, if we know how to take advantage of this change for the directions that we wish for, if we know how to do that wisely, then we have a friend in the White House. And it's not as if an enemy, God forbid, is leaving the White House. He really did impressively look after us and care for us. If we're talking about the collaboration in Intel, if we're talking about the technology and things for the next 10 years. But Israel did come across very problematic positions in the past, and I think that they're going to be more empathetic in the future. I think that you'll be surprised that on the positive side of this balance, I'm going to put the nuclear agreement with Iran. So I do not actually second that the GSPOA was actually successful, and I don't think that President Obama needs a second Nobel Prize for that. No, but I still was fearful that this could be a second Holocaust. But I think that in the short term, and we're talking about the short term, this nuclear agreement made the state of Israel more secure than it was last year. The Iranians that were just 2 months away from a bomb, they were completely rolled back to a number of years back from a bomb. And if they keep to that agreement, and they have so far, then our situation will be better in the coming years. But this agreement has two less positive aspects. If we're talking about short term, that we gave it a sort of 7 out of 10 or B minus grade. On the non-nuclear side that is not part of the agreement, then it is negative because it gives Iran so many more resources, it gives it immunity for all its negative conduct in the region, if we're talking about subversiveness, terror, and the detrimental effect on human rights, everything they do in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon, their support of Hezbollah, their support of the murder that is taking place in Lebanon and in Syria. All that has been reinforced by the agreement. The Iranians have more money, they have more resources, and more legitimacy, and the audacity to do what they're doing, the chutzpah. But I want you to know one thing. Everyone talks about the fact that Daesh, ISIS, is number one foe. But when we summarize the number of civil, innocent bystander fatalities in 2016, ISIS had only killed 1,500 people. The Russians hurt 3,000 and Assad 9,000. So remember these numbers because Assad did 9,000. And the worst part of this agreement is that long term, Iran has received, according to this agreement, it will have the legitimacy to be just an absolute zero range from the missiles. And after now, over 8, 10, 12 years, things are changing. That's how close they are to the bomb. So we are required to do what the Egyptians had to do when Joseph, our father in the Bible, told us we have to defend ourselves and prepare ourselves in those 7 lean years, prepare ourselves for the 7 fatter years.
I talked about the fact that we are deterring the terrorist organizations, and the real reason why we are deterring the terrorist organizations is that these are not purely terrorist organizations. These are terrorist organizations that have established themselves as a quasi-state. Hamas is controlling Gaza, and it's the government, and this is why it is not firing. And it's discovered a word that we don't have a good translation for it in Hebrew or Arabic, but it's accountability. He deserves to give them some answers. How come they're being bombed after they launched rockets at Israel? How come there's no water, no employment, no electricity? This is why they've, haven't done anything in 2 years, and Hezbollah is an inseparable part of the Lebanese government, and it gets to dictate who's going to be the president in Lebanon. It's the most significant military force in Lebanon, and this is why it's kept quiet for 10 years and haven't launched anything at us. And ISIS in Syria, they prefer to fight Assad and not Israel, and ISIS in the Sinai prefer to fight against the Egyptian military and not against Israel. I would like, especially for our guests from overseas, I would like to say that for the state of Israel, the threat posed by the Iranian Islamic Republic is much greater than the threat of the Islamic State, ISIS. So with all due respect to ISIS, at the end of the day, it's just another terrorist organization. We've lived with terror organizations. We've been living with terrorist organizations for 150 years now, and ISIS doesn't have ballistic missiles. It doesn't have tanks. It doesn't have airplanes, and it doesn't have any kind of air defense. And the most important point for us as Israelis, we are not facing ISIS on our own. But when it comes to Iran, we're pretty much on our own. But when it comes to ISIS, there's an entire coalition made up of 65 countries. Right here in this room, we have with us my colleague, General John Allen, who has led this coalition. There's another coalition, maybe not such a nice one, that's led by Syria and Assad and Iran and Hezbollah. So everybody's fighting against ISIS. So what we need to bear in mind is not to be so frightened by their videos that are scary and are hard to watch, and not to be frightened by sometimes the political tendency to present ISIS as some kind of a dramatic threat over the state of Israel. But the threat over the state of Israel has been and remains in its search for, and once it has a nuclear bomb that can eradicate us. I'll finish the positive part, and maybe I should step down from the podium after that. Anybody looking at the state of Israel sees a very economically strong country, and there are countries in Europe with such a huge deficit and the unemployment of young that's at double-digit percentages. But we are a stable country with some very good macroeconomic figures. Also, the debt to a GDP ratio at the level of inflation, etc. A leading high-tech sector, one of the leading high-tech sectors in the world. An industry of innovation and creativity that creates a lot of value. And even We've even stopped being angry with Moses that he took us to a country filled with milk and honey, and but no oil. But now we do have gas and energy, and if we finally come out with the right plan, then we will be more independent energetically, and our situation in this region will be much better. We have a $15 billion agreement with Jordan for Israeli gas, and this, of course, strengthens the ties. And one of the reasons why the Turks had put an end to the crisis, that they suffered a very harsh winter when the Russians, who have 60% of the gas in Turkey, they are in control of it, and they made their lives hard. And Israel is a cyber superpower. As I count the number of cyber superpowers in the world, Israel is definitely ranked at a very good place. There are six superpowers: the US, Britain, Russia, China, Israel, and, believe it or not, North Korea. And now I get to the more difficult part. So, what do we need to brace ourselves for? We need to first and foremost prepare for the less nicer parts of the JCPOA. And I guess one of the questions that the president of the U.S. asks himself on today, his second working day as president, is whether to renege or revoke this agreement. We think there's no point in doing that because the alternative to this agreement is problematic. But what needs to be done is to prepare for the Iranian behavior in the non-nuclear area, and to prepare for the bad 7 years. And that can be done in a much better way with an administration that's not committed to the agreement. But if anybody should violate this agreement, it's best that it be done by the Iranians, because the legitimacy, the word legitimization, is a very important word, and no measures against Iran can be legitimized if the U.S. will cancel it unilaterally without the consent of the other five superpowers. We haven't resolved our conflict with the Palestinians. In the 30 minutes I'd been given, I cannot explain our entire plan, but we do have one. We have a plan, and it parts from the all or nothing approach, our new program. Even those who do believe in a two-state solution assess currently that this arrangement is no longer possible. But the fact that it is no longer possible, it doesn't mean that we need to go downhill in a way that's completely out of control, because one country that contains all of the Palestinians inside it, and it won't be Jewish and it won't be democratic. And here I'm with John Kerry. I don't see eye to eye with him with respect to the settlements as a problem, or regarding the A word, and I'm even not going to use that word. But we don't want a situation that this country is either not Jewish or not democratic. And we can change the trend without reaching an agreement, because right now reaching an agreement is impossible. But we are a strong, powerful country. I've shown you that in the first part of my talk. So we don't need to be afraid. We can shape our border, our size, in such a way that the state of Israel will be, and I always am adamant about these four pillars. Jewish and democratic is not enough. It needs to be secure. We don't want to go back to the intifada that we experienced after the Oslo process, nor the rockets that we suffered from after the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. And strategically, it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't executed well enough from the security perspective and from other aspects as well. We want to be a Jewish, democratic, secure, and just as important, perhaps even more important, just. We want to be just. We want ourselves to be capable of looking at ourselves in the mirror, to look at our children and grandchildren, and to say, I live in a country in which justice and values and morals are the leading element. And we need to also fight for Israel's status in the world. And this is very strongly related, by the way, to the previous slide, because if we are a just country, if we are a country that does not control the lives of 2.5 million Palestinians, that finds the right arrangement for this country to be Jewish, and then I think then Israel's status and position in the world will rise and soar. There are internal tensions inside of Israel. We are an institute that deals with the external tensions, the external threats, Israel's foreign relations, but there are countries in the world that have collapsed while having 25,000 nuclear heads because they didn't know how to address the domestic tensions, the internal strife, and we also need to consider these internal tensions. So, when one formulates the State of Israel's strategy, it's important to pay attention that there are many tensions between the short term and the long term, tensions between the offensive and the defensive, tensions between the escalation and the desire to keep things quieter and calmer, and the tension between a force which is a military power that's military power versus a soft power. The problem of the State of Israel is that it is positioned, and you can see it is facing, as you can see in the green and red circles here, it is facing two very high bars. One bar is the bar of expectations. We can triumph over every enemy, but the expectation of the Israeli public is for the IDF to do it in a matter of 3 hours, maybe 3 days, and that there won't be a commission of inquiry. I don't think there will be a commission of inquiry, even if it lasts 6 days, but that's the expectation of Israelis, for it to be decisive, overwhelming victory, for the enemy to raise a white flag, and for the whole world to applaud us. Well, that is something that ended in 1967. We no longer have wars like that. The Israeli population needs to understand that our enemies are just as good as learners as we are. They've learned all of our advantages. They've discovered all our weakness points. So the wars will be longer than what we want them to be, and the victory won't be decisive, but we will achieve victory. So facing this level of expectations that's so difficult to rise to, we also need to deal with different laws of warfare. We do not bomb markets or hospitals, or we do not throw Molotov barrels, and we do not destroy things. Every bomb that we drop needs to be signed off by someone, both from the intelligence perspective and legally, and that makes the war much more difficult. And this is also something that our enemies are aware of, and they make things much more difficult for us because of the places where they position their fighting forces. So it won't be easy or simple, but it is achievable. I have 3 minutes left, so I'll soon finish. And we need to rebuild the trust that did not exist between us and the USA. And I would like to tell you that the USA is our only ally. And anybody who doesn't understand that, anybody who affects these relationships and it turns them into distant, cold, and lacking of trust, doesn't understand just how important the U.S. is. And that tremendous importance of the U.S. is not for somebody asking for one American soldier to have, to die for us. That's something we never asked, and we don't want that. And we can make do without the $38 million if necessary. There was a prime minister here 40 years ago who said that we can eat bread and margarine. But today, Israel is strong enough, even without the security assistance. But there's one place that if the U.S. isn't with us there, then we will find ourselves in a corner, in a very bad place in the world with a series of other countries that are sanctioned, and we don't want to be in line with these countries like North Korea and Russia. And this is what the USA protects us from. So we need to pay careful attention to that. And those who didn't understand that until today understood that on Friday, 2 weeks ago, because the UN Security Council Resolution 2334 is a very bad one, and it cannot be fixed even with the best pro-Israeli man will be the president of the U.S., because now the veto is French and British and Chinese and Russian, and this is why that's the number one task of anybody who's responsible for our relations with the U.S. in the years to come. We need to prepare for the bad 7 years. There are two levers we can use vis-a-vis Iran. One, it's proven that it's worked, and that's the sanctions. Sanctions are effective, painful sanctions on the oil sector, the financial sector. We need to enable that, because for that you need legitimization, in case you don't understand that, for the world to join us. And we also need to keep a credible military option. We need to see that the Iranians, who today think that the U.S. Does have such an option, but doesn't have the desire, and Israel perhaps does have the desire, but it doesn't have the option. The Iranians need to understand that the U.S. has the ability and the desire, if necessary. Of course, it's not recommended. It should be a last resort, but if necessary, it can happen. This is not what the Iranians had felt in the past few years, and now they need to understand, and we need to apply that as well, that Israel can as well. Now, I talked about the solution with the Palestinians. This is a tremendous opportunity to do that with the help of the Arab world. And ultimately, we need to plan. In spite of everything I told you about deterrence, it can fail tomorrow morning. It's enough for one rocket to hit, God forbid, a kindergarten or any public event with a concentration of people. That will lead us to another war, both in Gaza and in the north of Israel. The people of Israel, well, the president talked about that, so he has spared me the need to bring it up, but we need them all as loyal citizens, which are the identities that are not necessarily identical to our identities, but a part of Israeli society. And that's a must. We need to be engaged in a national dialogue regarding what Israel is, where we want to bring it to. And this is what I referred to in my opening comments. And in this last slide, you can see three windows of opportunities that are an outcome of Israel's strength, the fact that there's nobody who really wants to go to war with it in the near future, the fact that there's a more friendly administration in the U.S., and the fact that we have neighbors who see the Middle Eastern region eye to eye. So anybody who doesn't grab this opportunity and won't lead Israel to the right place is erring to his or her role as leader. Thank you very much.